Behind every glowing marquee light of old Hollywood, there was a body the studios built, sold, and sometimes destroyed. These were not just actresses. They were manufactured icons, shaped by contracts, cameras, and a public hungry for fantasy. One of them would die at 34 in a wreck that stunned the world. Another hit a genius the industry refused to see. This is the story of the women whose curves became currency, and the price some of them paid for it. Actor 1 Jane Mansfield. She arrived in Hollywood already understanding something most starlets never grasped. The camera didn't just capture beauty, it consumed it, and Jane Mansfield was determined to feed it on her own terms. By the mid-1950s, she had become one of the decade's most talked about blondes, her name inseparable from films like The Girl Can't Help It and Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter? Studio executives, always searching for the next Marilyn Monroe, positioned Jane as a direct rival, and they leaned hard into her exaggerated hourglass frame, reportedly measured at 40-21-35, turning her silhouette itself into a marketing tool. What set Jane apart wasn't just the numbers studios loved to publicize. It was her instinct for spectacle. She understood publicity the way a chess player understands the board, engineering headline-grabbing fashion moments, and cultivating a playful, winking on-screen persona that made audiences feel in on the joke. Typecast, more often than not, in comedic or overtly seductive roles, she was routinely underestimated, a mistake, because behind the platinum hair was a woman with real Broadway credentials and, by several accounts, an exceptionally high IQ. Beauty, brains, and boldness rarely coexisted so visibly in one public image, and for a time, that combination made her untouchable. But Hollywood's spotlight has always been a fickle thing. As the 1960s wore on, the roles thinned, the headlines quieted, and the industry that had once amplified her began to look elsewhere. Then, in 1967, at only 34 years old, Jane Mansfield's life ended abruptly in a car accident, a jarring, sobering coda to a career built on spectacle and glamour. The woman who had once outshined even her rivals in sheer publicity became, in an instant, a cautionary tale about how quickly the machine that builds an icon can also let her go. Jane's story set the tone for an era that idolized the body but rarely protected the person behind it. And no one embodied that tension more famously, or more enduringly, than the woman she'd been positioned against from the very beginning. Actor 2 Marilyn Monroe. If Jane Mansfield was built to challenge her, Marilyn Monroe was the standard the entire industry measured itself against, and still does. She remains, arguably, the single most recognizable face to ever come out of the studio system, a name that transcended film entirely to become shorthand for an era. Her performances in Some Like It Hot and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes cemented an image that the public devoured, the sensual, hourglass-figured blonde who seemed to embody 1950s glamour in every frame. Yet reducing Marilyn to that image was always a mistake, one the industry made constantly and one film historians have spent decades correcting. Beneath the bombshell surface was an actress with genuinely sharp comedic timing, capable of a vulnerability on camera that few of her contemporaries could match. Audiences responded not just to how she looked, but to something more elusive, a fragility mixed with charm that made her characters feel achingly human, even inside broad comedies. That duality is precisely why her legacy has outlasted so many of her peers. Decades after her death, Marilyn Monroe still shapes conversations about beauty standards, fame, and the cost of celebrity. She is invoked constantly, in fashion, in art, in every subsequent generation's search for its own blonde bombshell, precisely because no one has managed to replicate the particular alchemy she brought to the screen. She wasn't simply Hollywood's most famous body. She was, and remains, a symbol of everything complicated about turning a person into an icon. Her orbit pulled in nearly every bombshell who followed, including two women who, together with her, would come to define an entire category of stardom, one of whom built her career on refusing to apologize for anything. Actor 3 Jane Russell. Long before Manufactured Scandal became a marketing playbook, Jane Russell lived through one of Hollywood's earliest and most notorious examples of it. Her breakout came in Howard Hughes' The Outlaw, a film whose promotion focused almost entirely on Jane's figure rather than its plot. Hughes reportedly went so far as to design a custom brow specifically to accentuate her famously full figure, a detail that became industry legend in its own right. The twist, one that Jane herself would later confirm, is that she claimed she never actually wore the contraption. It hardly mattered. The controversy itself became the film's real advertisement, generating exactly the kind of scandalized headlines Hughes wanted, and it launched Jane into a fame that had almost nothing to do with her performance, and everything to do with the outraged machine surrounding her body. What made Jane different from so many actresses trapped in that same cycle was her refusal to play the passive object the story tried to cast her as. She was sharp, self-aware, and visibly in control of how she handled the attention, even while studios kept trying to sell her purely as a sex symbol. That intelligence showed clearly in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, where she starred alongside Marilyn Monroe and more than held her own, proof that she could share a frame with the era's biggest star without disappearing into her shadow. Jane Russell never ran from the scandal that made her famous. She used it, turned it into leverage, and built a career on being underestimated by executives who mistook her figure for her limit. Where Jane fought Hollywood's machine with wit, another star of the era would fight it by simply refusing to let the industry define who she really was underneath the fantasy. Actor for Rita Hayworth. Rita Hayworth's name wasn't even her own. Born Margarita Cancino, she was pushed by studio executives to change her name, alter her hairline, and reshape virtually every visible marker of her identity in order to fit the mold of an all-American star. It's a detail easy to forget while watching her at the height of her fame: flame-red hair, a smoldering gaze, an hourglass silhouette that made her the undisputed love goddess of 1940s Hollywood, but it's essential to understanding the woman behind the legend. Her breakout in 1940's IXS Gilda turned her into a global sensation almost overnight. A single scene, Rita removing one glove, fully clothed, nothing more, was considered so charged with seduction that it altered how sensuality itself could be portrayed on screen. Men adored her. Women imitated her. Studios built an entire mythology around her image. But that mythology came at a cost that the public rarely saw. Behind the glamour was a woman shaped, quite literally, by other people's expectations, her name erased, her features altered, her identity subsumed into a fantasy that audiences fell in love with instead of her. Rita brought genuine depth to her roles regardless, often imbuing her characters with a strength that belied the goddess label pinned to her. But the toll of that split, between the star the studio manufactured and the woman underneath, showed in one devastating quote that has outlived nearly everything else about her career. "Men," she said, "go to bed with Gilda, but wake up with her." It's a line that captures, more precisely than any headline could, exactly what it cost to become one of Hollywood's most desired women. Rita's story of reinvention and quiet heartbreak stands in sharp contrast to another star of the era, one whose greatest secret wasn't sorrow, but genius. Actor number 5, Hedy Lamarr. Of every secret old Hollywood kept, few are as astonishing as the one hidden behind Hedy Lamarr's face. Born in Austria, she first captivated European audiences with her daring 1933 performance in Ecstasy, then crossed into Hollywood where her exotic beauty and graceful figure made her an instant sensation. On the surface, her story reads like countless others of the era, a striking woman typecast as the mysterious, seductive foreigner, admired for exactly the qualities that limited her. But Hedy was hiding something no studio executive bothered to look for. During World War II, she co-invented a frequency-hopping technology designed to protect Allied torpedoes from enemy jamming, a real, patented innovation developed by an actress the industry had already decided was only useful for her looks. It's a detail so improbable it sounds invented, except that it's thoroughly documented. That very technology later became foundational to modern Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and GPS systems that the entire world now depends on daily. Hollywood, of course, never adjusted its perception of her. She continued to be cast as the glamorous mystery woman, her intellect essentially invisible to an industry only interested in her physical image. Hedy herself seemed to understand this contradiction with a kind of quiet, cutting irony, once remarking that any girl could be glamorous. All she had to do was stand still and look stupid. It's a line that reads less like a joke and more like a verdict on an entire system. Hedy Lamarr's legacy today has finally caught up to the truth. She wasn't just breathtaking, she was one of the era's most overlooked minds, proof that the industry's obsession with a woman's figure often blinded it to everything else she had to offer. Not every star of the period needed a hidden invention to prove her defiance, though some simply refused, loudly and publicly, to let anyone tell them how to behave. Actor 6 Mae West. Before Marilyn, before Jane, there was Mae West, and she arrived on screen at a moment when Hollywood was still clinging tightly to conservative ideals. In the 1930s, censors were watching closely, ready to clamp down on anything that pushed too far. Mae pushed anyway. She wrote her own scripts, crafted her own double entendres, and played women who were sensual, strong, and entirely unbothered by what polite society expected of them. Her figure, full, unapologetic, and deliberately showcased, became part of her brand decades before sex appeal was even a phrase used in marketing meetings. What made Mae genuinely radical wasn't simply that she was curvy and confident. It was that she refused to let studios or censors dictate the terms of her own image. She controlled the writing, the persona, and the innuendo herself, at a time when almost no actress, let alone woman, was permitted that kind of authority over her own career. Her most famous line, delivered with the same dry wit that defined her entire public persona, put it plainly: when she was good, she was very good, but when she was bad, she was better. It wasn't just a punchline. It was practically a mission statement. Her characters didn't just showcase her body for the audience's benefit. They centered on female pleasure, control, and confidence, ideas that were genuinely subversive in an industry that preferred its women decorative and silent. In an era that told women to behave, Mae West strutted directly through every boundary placed in front of her, rewriting the rules both on-screen and in her own contracts. Decades later, she's still remembered as one of Hollywood's boldest originals, and her influence on a very different kind of pin-up icon, one who worked entirely outside the studio system, would prove just as lasting. Actor 7 Diana Dors. Often labeled the British Marilyn Monroe, Diana Dors carried classic Hollywood-style curves across the Atlantic and turned them into a defining feature of post-war British pop culture. With golden hair, a full figure, and an attitude that photographed as pure confidence, she quickly became the United Kingdom's most glamorous cinematic export, and British tabloids, hungry for their own homegrown bombshell, couldn't get enough of her. Diana never shied away from the image built around her. If anything, she leaned into it deliberately, taking on roles that highlighted her voluptuous figure and, at times, playfully mocking the very stereotypes she'd been boxed into. She understood exactly how to move through a scene: the tight dresses, the deliberate grace, the precise instinct for lighting up a frame, turning what could have been a purely decorative role into something more calculated and self-aware. Beneath that carefully constructed sex symbol image was a woman with real wit and independence, qualities she wasn't afraid to display in interviews where she challenged the era's double standards directly and pushed back against the kind of rigid studio control that shaped so many of her American counterparts' careers. She navigated her own fame largely on her own terms, an accomplishment that shouldn't be understated given the period she was working in. Though she never quite reached the towering Hollywood heights achieved by Monroe or Loren, Diana Dors became something arguably rarer, a legend entirely in her own right, blending pin-up glamour with distinctly British charm and bite. Her own assessment of her fame captured that blend perfectly. She once joked that she was the only sex symbol Britain ever produced, and admitted it was a little embarrassing, really. That self-aware humor, paired with a presence audiences never forgot, is exactly what made Diana Dors a true original, one final proof that behind every one of these carefully manufactured images was a woman who, in her own way, refused to be only what the cameras wanted her to be. Actor 8 Anita Ekberg. Some careers are defined by decades of work. Anita Ekberg's was defined, in the public imagination, by a single unforgettable scene. Born in Sweden and crowned Miss Sweden in 1950, she arrived in Hollywood with striking beauty and a voluptuous figure that studios were eager to capitalize on. But it was in Europe, under the direction of Federico Fellini, that she found the role that would immortalize her. In La Dolce Vita, Anita waded through Rome's Trevi Fountain in a flowing black dress, and that single image became one of the most symbolic and endlessly referenced moments in the history of cinema. It wasn't just a beautiful shot, it was a moment that fused her physical presence with something larger than the film itself, turning her body into what critics would later describe as visual poetry, bold and impossible to forget. That fame came with the same limitations so many of her contemporaries faced. Anita was frequently typecast based purely on her looks, boxed into roles that leaned on her figure rather than her range as a performer. And yet she brought a genuine sense of confidence and mystery to nearly everything she appeared in, refusing to simply disappear into the background of her own image. She didn't chase stardom in the way so many actresses of the era were forced to. In a very real sense, it found her, frame by frame, almost against her will. In an industry built on glamour and fantasy, Anita Ekberg didn't just represent that fantasy. For a generation of filmgoers, she became its living embodiment. But not every star of the Golden Age found her power in a single cinematic moment. One young actress, in particular, would spend her entire life turning personal drama into headlines just as compelling as her films. Actor 9 Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor's rise was unusual even by Hollywood standards, because her magnetism was visible before she'd even left her teenage years. With her iconic violet eyes, porcelain skin, and a figure that drew attention long before most actresses her age were even considered for adult roles, she became a symbol of old Hollywood glamour remarkably early in her career. Studios, predictably, tried to fold her into the typical good girl mold that young starlets were expected to occupy. It never quite worked. Elizabeth's confidence, intensity, and increasingly curvaceous figure made her impossible to contain within that narrow image, and rather than fight the attention, she learned to own it entirely on her own terms. Whether she was commanding the screen as Cleopatra or navigating the emotional intensity of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, her presence had a magnetic quality that directors quickly learned to build entire films around. Off-screen, her life generated headlines that rivaled, and at times outpaced, her film career, from her much-publicized relationships to the sheer scale of her celebrity. Where other stars might have retreated from that level of scrutiny, Elizabeth remained unmistakably, unapologetically herself through all of it, refusing to shrink her personality to fit anyone else's comfort. That refusal is precisely why she's remembered as more than simply one of the most beautiful women to ever appear on screen. Elizabeth Taylor was bold, emotional, and constantly, unpredictably alive in the public eye, a star whose looks opened the door, but whose sheer force of personality kept her legendary for decades after. 2 decades later, one single film poster would prove that an image alone could define an entire era of pop culture, in a way even Elizabeth's headlines couldn't match. Actor 10 Raquel Welch. A single photograph can sometimes eclipse an entire filmography, and for Raquel Welch, that photograph was unavoidable. Her image in a fur bikini from 1 million years BC didn't just promote a movie, it came to define an entire visual era of pop culture almost on its own. With a fierce gaze, a sculpted figure, and an unmistakably confident screen presence, Raquel became a global sex symbol virtually overnight. That instant fame carried a familiar trap. Though her career skyrocketed largely because of that single image, Raquel had no interest in being reduced to it. She actively pushed against typecasting, deliberately seeking out roles that demonstrated real strength and intelligence rather than simply reinforcing the poster that had made her famous. Still, her hourglass figure and striking looks routinely overshadowed the range she was fighting to display. What set Raquel apart was her candor about exactly how exhausting that dynamic could be. She once described being a sex symbol as a heavy load to carry, particularly in moments of being tired, hurt, and bewildered by the expectations placed on her, an admission that resonated precisely because it punctured the fantasy so many people projected onto her. Unlike many stars who faded once the initial wave of attention passed, Raquel managed something rarer. She stayed relevant for decades, keeping firm control over her own image rather than surrendering it to studio machinery. The poster that made her famous remains a defining artifact of 1960s pop culture to this day, but Raquel Welch herself outgrew it, becoming something more lasting than a single photograph ever could capture. Across the ocean, meanwhile, and further south along the Mediterranean, other stars were proving that this same kind of magnetism could take entirely different cultural shapes. Actor 11 Sophia Loren. Sophia Loren wasn't simply a movie star, she was, from very early in her career, treated as a living emblem of Mediterranean beauty and sensuality itself. Born in Italy, she rose to international fame throughout the 1950s and 60s with a figure Hollywood found impossible to ignore and a screen presence that made her instantly unforgettable to audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. Her curvy silhouette and effortless natural charm became inseparable from her public identity, and Sophia leaned into that image with a wit that made her impossible to dismiss as simply another glamorous face. Her famous remark, crediting everything she had to spaghetti, became one of the most quoted lines of the era, equal parts self-deprecating and knowingly confident. But reducing Sophia Loren to her figure alone would miss the point entirely. Her poise, sharp wit, and considerable acting talent earned her genuine institutional respect, including an Academy Award, a rare achievement for an actress so heavily defined by her physical image in the public imagination. While countless actresses of her era were typecast purely for their looks, Sophia found a way to balance undeniable sex appeal with genuine dignity, a combination that eluded most of her contemporaries. She became a global sex symbol not by conforming to the stereotypes Hollywood tried to impose, but by owning her beauty with a confidence and grace that made the industry adjust to her, rather than the other way around. Even now, decades later, Sophia Loren endures as a symbol of elegance and unapologetic femininity, a legacy that another Italian star, working in a very different register, would echo in her own way. Actor 12 Gina Lollobrigida. Gina Lollobrigida didn't simply become a star. By her own account, she became something closer to a celestial body entirely. Born in Italy, she first captured public attention through beauty pageants and modeling before her real power was revealed on the big screen, where her dazzling smile, striking features, and famously curvaceous figure quickly earned her the nickname La Lollo. Her influence never stayed confined to Italian cinema. Hollywood couldn't resist her magnetic screen presence, and she went on to star alongside some of the era's biggest names, including Rock Hudson, Humphrey Bogart, and Frank Sinatra, a resume that placed her firmly among the industry's most sought-after leading ladies. It was Gina herself who delivered the line that would follow her for the rest of her career. She wasn't a star, she famously declared. She was a planet. Few who watched her on screen were inclined to argue. What made her sensuality so effective was how effortless it appeared, natural and completely unapologetic, rather than manufactured for the camera. That authenticity became central to her identity as a symbol of Mediterranean beauty and confidence. But Gina's talents extended well beyond performance. She was also an accomplished photojournalist and sculptor, proof that her artistry ran considerably deeper than the industry's narrow interest in her looks. In an era obsessed with a very narrow, manufactured kind of perfection, Gina Lollobrigida broke the mold through sheer boldness rather than conformity. She didn't chase fame in the way so many of her peers were forced to, she radiated it, and decades later, she remains a timeless symbol of strength and self-made success. Not every bombshell of the era carried herself with that same composed confidence, though some built entire careers on refusing composure altogether. Actor 13 Mamie Van Doren. Mamie Van Doren was Hollywood's unapologetic wild child, blonde, bold, and constitutionally incapable of being ignored. As one-third of the era's iconic 3Ms, alongside Marilyn Monroe and Jane Mansfield, Mamie carved out her own place in pop culture history, not merely because of her looks, but because of the sheer confidence with which she owned them. Throughout the 1950s, Mamie became one of the most widely postered pin-up figures of her time. Her platinum hair, sultry gaze, and famously curvy figure captured the decade's fixation on bombshell glamour perfectly, but she brought something to that image that distinguished her from simply being another studio-manufactured pin-up. She infused her public persona with genuine attitude, confidence, and a streak of rebellion that pushed against Hollywood's double standards well before doing so became common, or even acceptable. Mamie never treated her sex appeal as something to be shy about. Instead, she embraced it fully, on terms she set herself rather than terms dictated by studio executives eager to control every aspect of a starlet's image. While so many of her peers gradually faded under the weight of that same studio control, Mamie remained fiercely independent, even venturing to speak openly about subjects considered taboo at the time, a willingness that set her apart from actresses more inclined to protect their carefully managed public images. That defiance is ultimately what defines her legacy. Mamie Van Doren wasn't simply remembered as sexy, she became known as fearless, a distinction that mattered enormously in an industry built to punish women for exactly that kind of independence. Across the Atlantic, one more bombshell would take that same fearless energy and give it a distinctly British twist.